My name is Ydstedt. I'm an entrepreneur, advisor to Swedish industry and business organization, and chairman for Svensk Tidskrift, a foundation and a weekly magazine. The European Union spends 2.7 billion euros to increase vaccine production, but as much as 750 billion euros is spent on a recovery fund. I quote the European Commission website. To help repair the economic and social damage caused by the coronavirus pandemic, the European Commission, the European Parliament and European Union leaders have agreed on a recovery plan that will lead the way out of the crisis and lay the foundation for a modern and more sustainable Europe. It is called the European Union Recovery and Resilience Facility. One may wonder about the prioritization between cure against the pandemic and economic recovery. How little is spent on getting more vaccines. And the cost for the recovery fund is enormous, and no one really knows how or for what it will be used. Countries will most definitely interpret modern and sustainable differently. They will probably fight for this for years. The only thing that is clear is that taxpayers will have to pay, and that the politicians will get more power. There is much to be said about the management of the coronavirus in the European Union and its member states. I will focus here on not damaging the economy more than the pandemic has already done. The major cost of the pandemic is for lockdowns. The pandemic is probably only a notch in the growth curve, which by the way was already too low in the European Union before the pandemic. But the pandemic is directly devastating to many companies that have collapsed. Perhaps a life's work or even the creation of generations that have been lost in family businesses. Unemployment will increase, and we will definitely be worse off immediately after the pandemic. But I am optimistic that the world will recover, if, but only if, we let the market work. Vaccine might be the medicine for the corona disease, but growth is the cure for the economy. Even before the pandemic, many countries pursued the costly crisis policy. Low interest rates and the ECB asset purchase program has kept companies alive. Now corona programs created in Brussels are added on top of this. Stimulus and investment policy programs take financial resources from good investments, probably also competence. Of course, there are those who always see the state as a savior. They use the crisis as an excuse for more politics. But it's really worrying if center-right parties now join this agenda with government interventions, costly programs, etc. State subsidies will distort investments. Business with a solid business plan and products may be competed out of the markets by firms getting subsidies. Let's learn from history. Remember Ronald Reagan in 1986. The 9 most terrifying words in the English language are, "I'm from the government, I'm here to help." Also remember the New Deal. I'm very fond of the book The Forgotten Man by Emmett Schleis about Franklin D. Roosevelt. It's worth reading today. Schleis tells the story about how Franklin D. Roosevelt doubled the state budget, but in 1937, 8 years after the great stock market crash on Wall Street, there were still people starving in New York. I personally have great sympathy for companies being compensated for losses due to the lockdowns, because companies are not allowed to do businesses during the lockdowns, and also because the price tag for lockdowns must be visible. But the role of politics is to limit the threats and effects of the pandemic in crisis. When the crisis is over, the market must be allowed to work as free as possible and without being taxed excessively. I'm convinced that there is a depressed demand for consumption, need for traveling, visit to restaurants, and much more that we have been missing. States should not compete with this consumption. At some point, and already in the Financial Times and The Economist, the discussion about how to pay for state interventions during the crisis will start. The Financial Times and economists talk about raising taxes, especially on capital and businesses. This is a dangerous idea. In Sweden, we got vaccinated against this policy during the 1970s and 1980s. Sweden had punitive taxes against private ownership and had to pay dearly for this. High unemployment, weak growth, and falling real wages. Some of you have probably heard about famous writer Astrid Lindgren paying 102% in taxes in 1976. Finally, Sweden was forced to reform. From 1990s and on, Sweden has abolished taxes on wealth, on inheritance and gifts, and has reduced taxes on labor and entrepreneurship. With a lower tax burden, tax revenues have actually increased since we got rid of punitive taxes on labor and ownership. The tax ratio has declined from 49% to 43% of GDP since the year 2000, while tax income, adjusted for inflation, has increased by 620 billion Swedish kronors. I have written several books about how Swedish business climate have improved since we abolished inheritance and wealth tax. Some socialists in Sweden still dream about reintroducing these taxes, but most people got vaccinated against the ideas on new taxes on wealth. Let's hope the vaccination is still potent and working. There are increasing demands to address inequalities by increasing taxes on capital. The biggest inequality, of course, between those having a job and those not having a job. Therefore, investments and more businesses are key to reduce inequalities, and for that you need lower, not higher tax. I hope that your country will not get into the harmful cul-de-sac that Sweden did in the 1970s and 1980s. As I mentioned, most important for economic recovery is growth, and high taxes will harm growth. Increased borrowing, inflation, printing money, or issue bonds is equivalent to taxes. The Ricardian equivalence tells us that consumers are forward-looking and internalize the government's budget constraints when making their consumption decision. There is no such thing as a free lunch. My recipe is simple. Cut spending, sell government assets, and get rid of red tape against businesses. Make sure private investors get the possibilities to come up with the best solutions, not only for jobs, but also for digitalization and a greener development. Let's speculate about the near future. We still live with policies from the financial crisis, with artificial low interest rates and the asset purchase programs. These policies will keep companies alive that are really dead. Some big companies will stand in the way for new healthy businesses. Looking back to the aftermath of the financial crisis, we also had the start of the war on corporation tax. Politicians were telling voters that they could raise more taxes from multinational enterprises, but in reality, they are fighting for the same tax revenues, about where the taxes should be paid. This dangerous development will probably continue even stronger after the corona crisis. Remember that corporation taxes are a small part of total tax revenues, but could convince business to move. When businesses move, tax bases such as labor taxes and consumption taxes also moves. Please put an end to stupid retaliation against countries providing better conditions for businesses. Let me conclude. I am optimistic. I look forward to consuming much more when the pandemic is over. The same is true for billions of people. Get ready for a bright future. The only obstacle to economic recovery is bad politics. Let's fight together for free markets and open societies. Thanks for listening.